by understanding those key principles: the succession, the life cycle, and the strata that your trees sit in. Another thing that I'd like to speak to as well is that as much emphasis as we place on the crop plants that we want to get into the system, we also want to place that much emphasis on the supporting species that we have here as well. And those supporting species can be either your biomass production species or other plants that create an ecosystem within your food forest that bring in the birds that then bring in new seeds. So if we speak to the biomass producing plant supporting species, we're talking the Teutonia, we're talking the chicories, the plantains, the clovers, we're talking the sorghum grasses here that we've got bordering some of the beds, we're talking about the comfrey, all those things that basically produce biomass, so produce greenery, and that greenery, like we've explained in other videos, is capturing that sunlight, converting that into sugar that then is oozing into the ground, which is then feeding the host of mycorrhizal networks and bacteria within the ground. So then not only by chopping down these biomass producing plants and placing them on the ground are you creating topsoil above the ground, through their root systems and the sugars that they're exuding into the soil, they are also creating topsoil below ground as well, and that's how you really increase the fertility of your soil. And the other supporting species, like I mentioned, is the supporting species that you want to integrate that don't really bring food for you necessarily. Like we've got Tucoca, the cabbage tree in here, we've got Puriri in here, we've got Kohukohi in here. They're not necessarily producing food for us, but they are helping in creating an ecosystem here that feeds a variety of different pollinators and birds that do functions and fit into the niche of an ecosystem food forest that we really value, because they mitigate pests that we might have in the system. They host pollinators that will make our fruit trees produce fruit. Like we don't have to hand pollinate our cherimoyas because we're supporting the pollinators that will do that job for us. So yeah, not only having a focus on what we want in terms of the food and the density in which we can put that in, but also putting in those biomass drivers and those other supporting species to create that ecosystem that we so value in having that health of a food forest be strong.
Biomass producers, grasses, Teutonia, Coprosma, Faux.
So all up, this system can seem really complex and quite complex and not tangible or approachable in some cases because of the complexity that it asks for in creating this ecosystem. But what I really want to highlight there is that as humans we do have the capability for complexity, both in the skills that we can gain, the equipment that we have, the technology that we have, electric chainsaws, whatnot. As humans we have the capability to have that level of complexity in our skill and our knowledge. What we need to do is actually apply it to our growing systems. So often we actually exclude humans from our food production. We simplify it. We have one farmer with 1,000 hectares, and here these systems I find so beautiful because they basically include humans back on the land. We value that ability and that capability for complexity, and we apply it to our food systems, creating these complex ecosystems that actually call for us to be a part of it, that call for us to engage with it on a monthly basis, chopping, dropping, pulsing, seeing what's growing, having the seeds come up, observing, watching how they all interconnect and work together. That's super valuable to ground us in our garden, to ground us in our climate and engage our observation of nature and ourselves within it. And that's the main driver for me in this. It's not just about growing food, it's about growing ourselves back into the land by having such complex systems like this. We can simplify it to some degree as well, and in small things like planting things in rows, so that you're not constantly having to weave around all your different plants or accidentally cut things off. You know that the middle row has the plants that you don't want to cut, and then everything in the gaps between, you can chop all that and place it on without worrying that you're squashing anything or you're cutting into anything. And then having borders along your beds where you plant the grasses that then you also harvest from and put into that neutral space in between. Just simple things like that that do simplify a system, that do simplify a complex system, makes it that much more efficient and workable while still not compromising from the overall complexity and ecosystem that something like a food forest like this creates. So finding that bridge between efficiency and simplification, but still developing and creating and hosting an ability for the food forest to have a whole complex ecosystem that supports itself, that's climate resilient, that's soil resilient, water resilient, nutrient resilient. It's all cycling and breathing and being a part of a bigger picture that then we include ourselves into.